have come from Africans, well, African leaders who develop these initiatives, but without consultation from the grassroots. We take that into account and we try to get the people educated about what is going on. These are the policies that affect your life, and you need to have your say in these policies. Having the European Union developing a strategy for Africa was a bit of a sham for Africans, and we thought that, well, this was a very good opportunity for us. I mean, to hear now that there is something coming up as a partnership between EU and Africa. And being a partnership, we're hoping that it will be in a true sense of partnership, where it's still not a dictatorship kind of relationship, where you find that the European Union will sit and say, well, Africans, you need to adhere to your African peer review mechanism, and if you do that, we give you 5% more aid. And those kind of relationships are things that we need to question. You don't need to be able to talk to your partner and then you still hold the upper hand where you have the money and you're saying, if you don't do very well, I'm not going to increase money to you. So we need to start looking at those kind of partnerships that are being developed. And for African leaders, it's okay because they just want to get the aid. But for the people in Africa, what is the implication for them? If you aid is just, because when aid comes to Africa, it ends up being in the hands of the government, which most often it's very corrupt. And it's about, I think they should, in terms of how we see the EU-Africa strategy, it has to work at all levels. It shouldn't just be EU presidents speaking to African presidents. We need to start looking at all the different levels of society, from the grassroots to the middle classes, to NGOs, to CBOs, to FBOs, what we call faith-based organizations, community-based organizations. And all those people should be involved when we talk about development in the continent. Otherwise, it really doesn't help us as local Africans living in the continent. And at the end of the day, if we don't bring in what we call true partnership, which I think should be something that's not really partnership, shouldn't be looked at in terms of the money that we all bring on the table, but it's about how we look at each other as a continent, different continents and the people that live in this continent. And in terms of the EU strategy itself, coming from a peace building background, I'd like to talk about maybe the governance side of it, the peace and security issues, which are top of the agenda in both the European Union and the African Union. Peace and security is something that they talk about every day. But then the EU and African Union itself looks at it in terms of post-conflict kind of work, where people would wait for war to start, and then they have to send money and probably armed people to guard the peace process. And I think that from a peace-building perspective, we work a lot around conflict transformation. What we're talking about, it's not about the people that are shooting the guns, it's more about the attitudes of the individuals and the behaviors of the individuals. If you want to work around a long-term peace-building initiative, you need to look at how the people feel. You need to work with people that work on the ground and try to change the attitudes of individuals that would start the war. Because what would happen is people would sign agreements at the top level because probably you've sent a lot of UN special envoy or the AU peace operations who are being killed every day, because the mentality of the individuals that are being affected by these wars have not changed. They still have the hatred in their hearts for each other. So we think that in order to be able to solve the violent conflicts in Africa, we need to still go through all the levels in society. Coming from the grassroots side, we work a lot with changing the attitudes of people and the behaviors. Relationships among people are very important. If we don't start changing those relationships, then we're not building any peace. It's going to be a short-term peace, and hence you find that in Africa, wars just keep going on and on. No matter how many peace-building initiatives that come on, they never stop. In terms of governance, we think that there needs to be some kind of accountable governance being pursued. Yes, the African Union has got the African peer review mechanism, but how accountable is that mechanism? So we want to look at, would love for the EU to look at a governance process that is a bottom-up approach, where the governments becomes transparent, they become accountable to their citizens, and hence, at the end of the day, would have a lasting democracy in the countries. Otherwise, what we would have is an African peer review mechanism process where you would have the governments just trying to satisfy what the EU expect from them, because the EU is saying, I'm supporting the APRM process, And if you do well in your governance initiative, we're going to give you some money, then governments will struggle just to do that by hijacking the process and not making it involving, and hence coming up with a document that they will present and then get more money, which is not very helpful for the continent itself. In terms of security, we want to see some kind of, well, our states in Africa believe too much in state security, and there is this shift from it now to human security, which civil society is trying to advocate within the continent, and we think that we need to start looking at meeting people's basic needs instead of trying to protect our states. In most of the countries, people spend a lot and lots of money, thousands, in order to get their military intact, just in case there's a coup. Because you have been there for ages, you know that there will be a coup anytime. You want to keep your army very tight and make sure that whatever happens, you are well protected. But this is being done in the detriment of the citizens in the country, and hence money which is supposed to have gone to basic services like schools, like clean water, are being used to provide their soldiers and armies with guns so that they can protect them as presidents. All in all, we think there are a lot of issues within the EU-Africa strategy that I'd like to talk about. I mean, from the EPAs, which a lot of African countries are refusing to sign because of one or two reasons. I mean, it's very distressing to hear. We launched this book yesterday, and we had the EU Commission being part of it, and they also mentioned a lot around how the EPA is something extremely important, and if Africans don't sign it, then there's nothing they can do. There's going to be a horrible consequence for Africa, and I thought that was so distressing because they said that it's because the WTO, they can't do anything because WTO will take measure of the consequences for the African countries if they don't sign these EPAs. And even though West Africa have refused to sign, and they've decided that the EU has decided to put in more in terms of what is on the table, West Africa has to refuse to sign, and they're claiming that because of that, there is nothing that the EU will be able to do. And at the end of the day, who talks to the WTO? I think it's the EU. So we need to look at all those parameters where people try, the European Union wants to be partners with Africa and using that as an aspect of development, and at the end of the day, it still becomes some kind of a dependency theory where Africa still has to depend a lot on the EU. We believe in the initiatives that have been developed, and we're hoping that the European Union would use these initiatives from Africa to be, rather than bringing new initiatives from the EPAs and saying, we want to bring this initiative because that one was developed by Africans, I don't think that is going to help us. The more policy documents that we have on board, the less work we're going to do, because we're going to end up using our time to draft documents, to argue about them, and waiting for me to sign it because this government hasn't signed, we can't put it into effect. And at the end of the day, years and years go by without us doing any actual work. So we're hoping that this should be the end of documents. The EU-Africa partnership should be the last document that we're seeing, if it's ever signed. And we're hoping that Africans should be able, together with the EU, to push for the implementation of what is already there rather than keep on signing other documents. In conclusion, I would say that we believe that as Africans, there shouldn't be any development for us without us. And we think that if you want to talk about development, it shouldn't end at the policy level. It should be able to penetrate down to the lower and the grassroots person on the ground. Thank you very much. I really hope that will
work. Thank you to Ms. Ayong Ameck. Thank you very much for your contribution and for this additional southern perspective to our debate tonight. I can assure you that the European Parliament, and especially its Development Committee, listen very carefully the voices of from civil society in the South, and will try to take your message very carefully. And now please have a look at the exhibition and to follow the call Action Against Poverty, and also have a drink with us. Thank you.